Life in the shadows. Who were the peasants? The structure of medieval society. In the quiet heart of the medieval world, society stood not as a circle, not as a free-flowing community, but as a rigid pyramid. At the top sat the king, God's chosen ruler on earth. Beneath him, like steps carved from stone, came the lords, the knights, and finally, at the base, so wide, so heavily burdened, stood the peasants. Peasants were the invisible backbone of the entire feudal world. Their hands fed the lords, clothed the clergy, and sustained the knights who rode in the name of honor. But in return, they lived in mud-walled cottages, paid taxes in grain and sweat, and were often forgotten in the pages of royal chronicles. And yet, without them, nothing would stand. Medieval society operated on a system called feudalism. Land was the currency of power, and kings granted vast swaths of it to lords in exchange for loyalty and soldiers. Those lords then parceled out pieces to knights, who in turn relied on peasants, serfs and villains, to work the land and keep the system running. Peasants received protection, and in return, they gave everything they had. It was not a fair trade. The church, too, held immense power. Its bishops and abbots were often richer than many nobles. It preached that society's structure was divinely ordained, that kings ruled by God's will and peasants served because it was their heavenly duty. This belief wasn't just taught. It was reinforced through art, sermons, and fear. To question your place was to question God. A peasant's rank was fixed. Social mobility was rare, and rebellion dangerous. Still, the peasants held on, tightly, to their communities, their traditions, and a quiet kind of dignity. While lords wielded swords and scribes penned law, peasants tilled fields, bore children, and whispered stories into the firelight. Their role may have been low in title, but it was monumental in labor and spirit. They were the unrecorded historians of the land, their lives etched not in books but in furrows and fences. In the rigid, stratified world of medieval society, peasants were both the bottom and the foundation, and they carried that weight for centuries. What made a person a peasant? You were born into it. That's the simplest answer. To be a peasant was not a choice. It was a birthright shaped by soil, surname, and silence. If your parents were peasants, so were you. You'd likely live, work, and die within a few miles of where your umbilical cord was buried. Upward movement was as rare as snowfall in midsummer. Being a peasant wasn't just about poverty. It was a legal status. Some peasants were serfs, meaning they were legally bound to the land. They could not leave without the lord's permission. They could be sold with the land, but not like chattel slaves. Others were villains, a little freer, but still required to give labor and dues to the lord in return for their tiny plot. A small minority were free peasants, who owned their land or rented it directly. But even they were tied by custom, taxes, and fear. Most villages were not full of opportunities. They were full of rules, duties, and expectations. It was a system that ran on predictability. You didn't aspire. You endured. Education was non-existent. A peasant might never learn to read or write. Their knowledge came from the land, when to plant, how to coax food from stubborn earth, how to deliver a baby in the dark of winter, how to heal a cough with moss and honey. It was a different kind of intelligence, passed not through scrolls but through generations. To be a peasant was to live in the present. There was no retirement, no savings. Your wealth was measured in bushels and goats, not coins. You worked until your body broke, and often long after. And yet, peasants were not without pride. They knew the value of honest labor. They celebrated births and mourned deaths together. They shared bread with the hungry. They may not have been knights or lords, but they were survivors, and in their world, that meant everything. Daily life in a mud and thatch home. Picture it, a single-room cottage, its walls made of wattle and daub, sticks and mud woven together and whitewashed when possible. The roof, thatched with straw, easily flammable and a home to mice and insects. The floor, bare earth. Not a metaphor, literal dirt beneath your feet. And yet, this was home. The hearth was central, not just for warmth but for light and cooking. There was no chimney, so smoke curled upward and gathered in the rafters, eventually drifting out through holes in the thatch. The air always smelled of fire, dampness, and livestock. In many homes, animals, especially chickens and pigs, shared the space, especially during the bitter winters. Furniture was minimal: a rough wooden table, a bench, maybe a bed stuffed with straw if you were lucky. Most slept on blankets on the ground. A single candle might last days. Privacy was a foreign concept. The whole family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, slept in the same room. Babies were born there. Elders died there. Cleanliness was more practical than pristine. Baths were rare. Water had to be fetched from a well or stream. Clothes were mended endlessly. Soap, if used at all, was made from animal fat and ashes. Yet these homes were filled with life. Children laughed. Bread was baked. Herbs were hung from beams to dry. Peasants carved patterns into spoons, embroidered cloth, and told stories by firelight. The walls echoed with lullabies and legends. It was hard, yes, but it was also human. Their homes were not castles, but they were shelters. Within them, peasants carved out moments of love, resilience, and laughter. The mud walls held not just people, but memories. Work from dawn to dusk. The rooster was not just a bird. It was an alarm clock. When it crowed, the village stirred. Light or dark, rain or shine, the day began early. There was no sleeping in. Every hour mattered. Peasants rose before the sun and often worked until its last rays vanished beyond the fields. Men tilled soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen. Women carried water, fed livestock, churned butter, and tended children, all at once. Tasks were endless and repetitive, but every one was vital. There were no weekends. The only breaks came with holy days, feast days and saints' days, granted by the church. These were cherished like gifts, not because of rest alone, but because they brought music, bread, and community. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant sowing, summer meant weeding, autumn was harvest, life or death depending on its yield. Winter was a cruel reprieve, where time slowed but hunger grew. There was no specialization. A peasant was a farmer, carpenter, shepherd, butcher, and weaver all in one. Tools were few: axes, sickles, scythes, and often shared among neighbors. Blisters and backaches were constant companions. Children worked too. As soon as they could walk, they helped, scaring birds from fields, gathering wood, tending lambs. Childhood was short, but laughter still rang through the trees. And still, despite the pain and sweat, peasants found rhythm in their labor. They sang while they worked. They told riddles. They passed stories down with each task. Their work was a kind of music, and in its repetition, they found meaning. Life in the shadows. Who were the peasants? Clothing, tools, and the simple life. A peasant's wardrobe was not made for style. It was built for survival. The clothing they wore day after day was thick, scratchy, and coarse. Wool, homespun and roughly dyed with local plants or left undyed in natural tones, was the standard fabric. Flax might be used for linen undergarments, but for most, even that was a luxury. Men wore long tunics belted at the waist, with hose or woolen trousers underneath. Their feet, if shod at all, were protected by leather shoes or simple sandals, often patched and passed down through the family. Women's garments were long woolen dresses with aprons and kerchiefs or coifs to cover their hair. Everyone wore layers, not just for warmth but because washing garments was a burdensome task. Clothes were rarely washed, often only a few times a year. For the peasant, clothes had to last. There was no summer and winter wardrobe. Patching and mending were skills every household practiced. A torn sleeve wasn't thrown away. It was stitched and reinforced, sometimes with mismatched fabric that told its own quiet story of resourcefulness. As for tools, peasants owned little, and most of it was handcrafted or passed down through generations. A family might have a wooden plowshare, far less efficient than iron, an axe, a sickle, and a spade. These were often shared or borrowed within the village. Iron tools were rare and precious, maintained carefully. A broken blade could mean disaster during harvest season. They also made their own household items: spoons, bowls, stools, often from wood gathered nearby. Clay pots were molded by hand or bartered from a local potter, traded for food or labor. These were not disposable possessions. They were treated with care and often handed down as heirlooms. Luxury meant having a good cloak for winter or owning more than one tunic. It meant boots instead of shoes, or woolen mittens to shield the frost. And still, despite the simplicity of life, peasants took pride in what little they had. Clothes were dyed with herbs for color, patterns were stitched into sleeves, and wooden spoons were carved with designs. Even in poverty, creativity bloomed. This simplicity shaped not just their appearance but their worldview. Life wasn't about accumulation. It was about function, endurance, and quiet joy in the little things. A warm cloak, a sharpened sickle, or a new pair of shoes after the old ones finally fell apart. Church bells and holy days. The church towered over every aspect of medieval life. It wasn't just a building in the village. It was the beating heart. Bells rang out to mark time, summon for prayer, warn of fire, and celebrate feast days. To the peasant, the church was a calendar, a judge, a doctor, and a teacher all in one. Life revolved around the liturgical calendar. There were dozens of feast days, celebrations of saints, holy events, and seasonal observances. These days gave peasants their only rest from labor. While a lord might dismiss their importance, to the poor, these were golden moments of rest, laughter, and bread. Mass was mandatory, even if you didn't understand Latin. Priests were the only literate men in many villages, and they held tremendous power. They performed baptisms, blessed crops, offered last rites, and preached about heaven and hell. The church taught that your suffering had meaning, that hardship in this life would be rewarded in the next. The church also provided a moral framework. Sins were confessed. Punishments might be public, like penance or fasting, but they were also spiritual. Many peasants feared excommunication more than death, believing it meant eternal damnation. Religious imagery surrounded them. Wall paintings, wooden crosses, carvings of saints. They were visual guides in a world without books. The stories of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and martyrs were told and retold in sermons and miracle plays, often performed in the town square. The church's power wasn't always benign. It collected tithes, usually a tenth of a peasant's grain or income, and enforced strict rules on marriage, sexuality, and behavior. Yet it also provided hope. In times of plague or famine, people fled to the altar. They lit candles for the dead. They prayed for rain, for mercy, for strength. For the medieval peasant, religion wasn't a Sunday obligation. It was daily reality. God was in the rain, the harvest, the birth of a child, and the fading of an old man's breath. The church reminded them that while their feet were buried in mud, their souls could still reach heaven. Living with livestock. Step into a peasant's home and you might find chickens underfoot, a pig in the corner, or a goat peering through the doorway. Livestock wasn't just essential to life. It was part of the family, part of the rhythm of existence. They gave food, income, labor, and, sometimes, warmth. Cows, if a family could afford one, were prized above all. A single cow meant milk, butter, and eventually beef. Chickens provided eggs and occasionally meat. Pigs were valuable for their fat and meat, and were often slaughtered in the fall, with every part used, nothing wasted. Goats were common in hillier regions, where pasture was harder to come by. Sheep gave wool, milk, and meat, though most flocks were owned by the manor or monastery and tended by shepherds. Horses were rare among peasants. Oxen did the plowing. In winter, animals were brought inside, not just for their safety, but for the warmth they offered. Their body heat helped fight the bitter cold. This closeness meant that peasants were intimately familiar with the sounds, smells, and habits of animals. Children grew up beside them, learned to milk and feed them, and mourned when they died. Disease was a constant threat. If a cow fell ill or a pig died suddenly, it wasn't just a loss, it could mean starvation. Animal theft was a serious crime, sometimes punished by death. Still, peasants learned to breed, barter, and protect their animals fiercely. They used herbal remedies to treat illness, fashioned simple pens and shelters, and passed down knowledge of animal care through generations. A good shepherd was respected. A skilled milkmaid was cherished. Living with livestock wasn't glamorous. It was noisy, smelly, and sometimes dangerous. But it was necessary. These animals were more than food. They were survival incarnate. Food, porridge, bread, and hope. If you think of medieval peasant food as bland, repetitive, and humble, you'd be mostly right. But it was also deeply tied to the land and the seasons. And in the rare moments of plenty, it was celebrated. Bread was life. Made from rye, barley, or oats, depending on what grew best in the region, bread was the daily staple. Wheat, considered finer, was often reserved for the nobility. A good harvest meant soft, dense loaves. A bad one meant moldy crusts and hollow bellies. Porridge was a daily meal, boiled grains, sometimes flavored with onions, herbs, or scraps of meat. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips were common, grown in small kitchen gardens. Peasants learned to stretch meals with legumes, nuts, and wild greens. Meat was rare, but when available, it was cherished. Hunting was illegal for peasants in most areas. Game belonged to the lord. But rabbits and birds might find their way into stew pots by accident. Pigs and chickens were raised for occasional feasts. Dairy, cheese, milk, butter was a valuable source of fat and protein. Eggs added variety. Apples, berries, and nuts were foraged from hedgerows. Honey sweetened gruel and tea. Food scarcity was always a threat. A wet season could ruin crops. A poor harvest could mean famine. And yet, meals were social. Families ate together, shared what little they had, and made feast days into something magical. On holidays, meat might be roasted, ale shared, and tables set with more than one dish. Food wasn't just fuel. It was tradition, memory, and gratitude. Every crumb mattered. And even in the worst years, peasants found ways to flavor their lives, with herbs, laughter, and hope. Children in the fields. Childhood was short, but not joyless. From the moment a child could walk, they were expected to help. Little hands scattered seeds, fetched water, chased birds from crops, and fed the hens. Play was rare, but so were idle hands. Boys were taught to follow their fathers, learning to plow, sow, harvest, and mend. Girls followed their mothers, learning to cook, sew, tend gardens, and care for younger siblings. Education was almost unheard of unless you lived near a monastery or had a rare literate priest. Toys, when they existed, were handmade, wooden dolls, rag balls, or little carts carved by fathers on winter nights. Games were simple, often involving singing, chasing, or riddles. Festivals gave children a rare chance to dance and laugh without labor. Child mortality was tragically high. Illness, accidents, and malnutrition claimed many young lives. But those who survived learned resilience early. By 10, many were capable farmhands. By 12, they were expected to work like adults. Children were not coddled, but they were loved. Parents prayed for them, worked for them, and sometimes sacrificed food to feed them. Their lives were harsh, but their families were close. And even amidst the hardest days, the sound of a child's laughter could still echo across a muddy field. A peasant's view of the world. To a peasant, the world was small but deeply meaningful. Their universe was bounded by the village, the manor, the church, and the fields. They knew little of kings and distant wars. Their maps were made from footpaths and fences. The sky was God's canvas. The soil was sacred. The forest was both friend and foe. Nature was unpredictable and powerful. Storms could ruin a crop. A dry summer could bring starvation. But it was also beautiful. Birds, stars, and changing seasons were noticed, honored, and feared. They understood time not in hours but in seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer meant weeding. Autumn was harvest. Winter was survival. The moon and sun were their clocks. Bells were their alarms. Their beliefs mixed Christianity with old traditions. They feared witches and spirits, respected saints and relics, and told tales of miracles and monsters. Superstition was everywhere. A charm to protect cattle, a prayer before sowing, a piece of iron above the door. But despite hardship, their worldview was not bleak. It was grounded in gratitude, in the joy of a shared meal, in the miracle of a healthy child, in the beauty of a good rain. They had no grand ambitions, but they had purpose. To a peasant, the world was hard, but it was also sacred. They lived humbly, but not without meaning. And though their names rarely made history, their lives shaped it, one furrow at a time. Lords of the land, power and burdens. The feudal pyramid. In the hushed twilight of a medieval countryside, life was shaped not by speed, but by structure. The world of the peasant was not just bound by earth and sky, but by a human-made pyramid of power. At the very top sat the king, a distant, almost mythical figure, rarely seen but deeply felt. Beneath him stood powerful nobles, barons with vast lands and the favor of the crown. Then came the knights, often clad in armor and honor, followed at last by the peasants, who bore the burden of this great tower on their tired shoulders. The feudal pyramid was more than just a hierarchy, it was a way of organizing life. Everyone owed something to someone above them. The peasant gave labor and goods to the lord. The lord gave loyalty and military service to the king. And the king? He offered protection, or at least the promise of it. It was a system designed not for fairness, but for function. Yet in its rigidity, it offered a kind of predictability, something steady to cling to as the seasons turned and the years crept by. What the lord expected. To the medieval peasant, the local lord was both landlord and lawgiver, protector and punisher. From their modest homes, peasants looked toward the manor house with a mix of reverence and unease. The lord expected more than obedience, he expected service. There were days spent working the domain, the lord's personal fields, without pay. These were known as labor services and were part of the rent a peasant owed, even after tending to their own tiny plot. The lord might also demand food, a portion of the peasant's grain, or some of the chickens raised in backyard pens. Sometimes the demands came suddenly, a summons to haul wood, repair a roof, or mend fences. All of this was expected, unquestioned. To deny the lord was to risk punishment, eviction, or worse. Yet, for many, the demands, harsh as they were a normal rhythm of life, like the tolling of a church bell. Rents, taxes, and more taxes. If the feudal world had a constant echo, it was the whisper of owed debts. Rent was due, in kind or in coin. Taxes, too, came knocking, at harvest, at marriage, at death. A tax for using the Lord's mill. A fee to bake bread in the Lord's oven. Another to cross a bridge, or graze animals on certain pastures. Every corner of peasant life was measured and priced. And then came the king's taxes. Royal levies for wars fought far away, for crusades, or the ransoming of noble prisoners. Even if a peasant never left their village, the cost of foreign battles landed at their door. For most, there was no escape, only acceptance. They paid what they could, when they could. And if they couldn't, debt lingered like a shadow, dark and ever-present. Manorial courts and petty crimes. Beneath the spreading branches of the manorial oak or within the timbered hall of the manor house, justice was served, not with robes and gavels, but with familiarity and fear. The manorial court was not for grand trials of murder or treason, but for the small things. A broken fence, a stolen chicken, a borrowed cart never returned. These were the courts of the village, where neighbors stood to accuse neighbors, and where the lord or his steward passed judgment. Fines were common, and even the smallest misstep, a quarrel in the fields or an insult, could mean a penalty. For peasants, the court was not just about law, it was a reminder of who ruled, and who must bend. Yet, the court also kept a strange kind of order. In its rigid structure, there was at least a sense of how the world worked, and how one might live within it. The fear of punishment. Disobedience in the medieval world had sharp teeth. Beyond the manorial court lay harsher realms, the king's justice, the church's wrath. But even within the manor, punishment was feared. Fines, though common, could sting deeply in a world where every coin mattered. For more serious offenses came time in the stocks, public shaming, or even imprisonment. Rumors drifted through villages, of thieves with ears cut off, of heretics burned in distant towns. Fear worked as a quiet governor, guiding behavior, discouraging rebellion. Even when the law was unfair, it was constant. For many, it was safer to obey, to stay silent, to live quietly beneath the weight of authority. They did not sleep without fear, but they did find rest in survival. Being called to war. Though most peasants lived and died within a few miles of their birth, the specter of war sometimes reached their door. Lords, bound by oaths, might be called to battle, and they, in turn, could summon their men. Sometimes this meant trained retainers, but other times, it meant peasants. With little choice, they picked up crude weapons and followed banners into the unknown. These calls were rare for most, but terrifying. Not all returned. For those left behind, wives, children, the elderly, there was worry and waiting. But war, even when distant, had local cost. Fields were left untended. Homes sat empty. And if the battle came too close, villages might burn, crops be stolen, and families torn apart. Yet even so, life returned, slowly, as it always did. Peasant rebellions, quiet whispers. Not all peasants remained silent. Across the centuries, whispers of rebellion rose into voices. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 stirred hearts and fears alike. But most resistance was quiet. Grumbles behind hedgerows, late-night gatherings, a refusal to pay, a flight to a new village under cover of darkness. Rebellion was dangerous, often fatal. Yet the mere existence of protest was a reminder. The burden was heavy, and not all bore it quietly. Still, uprisings were few, and success even rarer. Most peasants remained rooted, like the trees they worked beneath, bending in the wind, but not breaking. And when rebellion failed, the punishments came swiftly, ensuring the village slumbered again in uneasy peace. The role of the bailiff. If the lord was the head, and the peasant the hands, the bailiff was the arm that enforced the will. A local man, often from a slightly higher class, the bailiff oversaw the estate. He managed labor, collected dues, ensured the fields were plowed and planted on time. His word carried the weight of the lord's authority. To the peasant, the bailiff was a figure of both familiarity and power. He might know every family by name, yet still command them to work, to pay, to obey. Some were fair, others harsh, but all were unavoidable. The bailiff kept the manor running, efficiently, profitably, and in his shadow, peasants moved carefully, always aware of who watched and who judged. Why peasants stayed? With so much burden, why did peasants stay? Why not run, resist, rebel? The answer, like the life they lived, was layered. For some, it was fear, of punishment, of starvation, of the unknown. For others, it was community, roots planted deep in village soil, surrounded by kin, friends, shared memories. There was also hope, small, stubborn, but real. A good harvest, a kinder lord, a marriage, a child, a feast day. The rhythm of life offered moments of joy amidst the toil. Leaving meant more than fleeing hardship. It meant abandoning everything known, every safety net, every comfort of familiarity. And so, they stayed, not because they were weak, but because they were strong in ways we often forget. Legends of kind lords. Though many lords were harsh, stories survived, passed around fires and whispered in cottages, of lords who showed mercy. A nobleman who forgave debts after a harsh winter. A lady of the manor who visited the sick and brought bread. A knight who shared spoils from a raid with his villagers. These were exceptions, not the rule. But the stories mattered. They offered peasants a dream, that power could be gentle, that nobility could mean kindness. Whether these legends were truth, myth, or something in between, they gave shape to hope. And in the stillness of night, as peasants drifted to sleep beneath thatched roofs, perhaps it was these stories that warmed them more than any fire. Plagues in the air, surviving the Black Death. The first signs of the plague. It began quietly, like the rustling of autumn leaves before the winds of winter. The year was sometime in the mid-14th century, and in sleepy European villages, life followed a predictable rhythm. sunrise, toil, prayers, and rest. People lived in close-knit communities, surrounded by fields, forests, and the ever-turning wheel of the seasons. But something changed. At first, it was just a rumor. Whispers from travelers and merchants returning from the east told of a strange illness. They said it had begun far away, beyond the Silk Road, beyond the seas, perhaps in the steppes of Central Asia or the harbors of the Black Sea. The tales were easy to ignore at first. Every few years, some sickness or famine swept through the land. But this felt different. The stories were darker, quieter. People spoke of whole towns gone still, of ships drifting into port with no living crew. Then, the first signs appeared. In a modest town along a trade route, a child grew feverish. He coughed through the night, his body hot and trembling. His mother wrapped him in wool and whispered prayers. By morning, dark swellings had appeared under his arms, and his breath had grown shallow. By dusk, he was gone. Within days, others followed. The symptoms were unmistakable. A sudden fever, headaches, painful swellings, buboes, under the arms and between the legs. Sometimes there were black blotches on the skin. People coughed blood. Many died within a few days. Panic spread slowly, like ink in water. At first, there was denial. The local priest assured villagers that it was just a fever, perhaps sent as a test of faith. But when the priest himself fell ill, people began to worry. The Black Death had arrived. It would take weeks, sometimes only days, for entire households to fall. It moved from town to town, quietly hitching rides on fleas, rats, and the clothing of travelers. No one knew what caused it, and no one knew how to stop it. The first signs of the plague were not just the physical symptoms. It was the silence of the roads, the empty market stalls, the sudden absence of neighbors. It was a world beginning to close its doors. Death in the village. The rhythm of village life was broken. In places where laughter once echoed from barns and courtyards, there was now quiet weeping. The village bell, once used for calling people to prayer or feast, now tolled endlessly to mark the dead. One name after another. And then silence again. In small rural communities, where everyone knew each other, the impact of each death was deeply personal. A father, then a mother. A child. A neighbor. In some villages, half the population was gone within a month. In others, no one remained to count. Cottages were left open. Doors hung loosely from hinges. Livestock wandered freely, unmilked, and fed. Crops withered in the fields. Bread was no longer baked. Life retreated into stillness. Those who remained lived in fear. They stopped greeting one another on the road. Children were told not to speak to strangers. Windows were shuttered. Some tried to flee to the forests, believing the trees would protect them. Others stayed behind, too weak or too loyal to leave. The death came quickly. Sometimes people collapsed in the streets. Other times, whole families simply vanished. Often, there was no one left to bury the dead. In desperation, surviving villagers dug long trenches to lay bodies side by side. No ceremony, no markers, just the cold earth. In some places, dogs and pigs roamed through empty houses. Cats disappeared. The usual sounds of the village, roosters crowing, the clatter of tools, the murmurs of prayer, were replaced by silence, broken only by the sound of crows or the occasional cry of a widow. The plague was not just a sickness. It was an emptiness that hollowed out communities. A slow, quiet collapse of ordinary life. Prayers, herbs, and superstition. With medicine powerless, people turned to what they knew. Prayer was the first defense. Chapels were filled with the voices of the desperate. Even as priests fell ill, those who remained led small groups in hymns, begging for divine mercy. Some believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. Others thought it was the devil's work. Religious processions began to form, with people walking barefoot through towns, whipping themselves to atone for their sins, hoping that suffering might stop the disease. Alongside prayer came herbs. Garlic, sage, rosemary, and lavender were burned in homes or carried in pouches. People wore posies, small bundles of fragrant herbs, to protect themselves from bad air. Vinegar was sprinkled on floors. Lemon was rubbed on the skin. Nothing worked for long, but it gave comfort. Superstition blossomed. Some believed that the stars had aligned in a dangerous way, and the heavens were angry. Others thought the plague was spread by dogs or Jews, leading to terrible acts of blame and violence. In some places, people avoided bathing, fearing that water opened the pores to infection. In others, they drenched themselves in perfumes. Amulets were worn. Special prayers were recited at dawn and dusk. Bells were rung to drive away evil spirits. Some households painted protective symbols on their doors. Mothers whispered old spells over their children, handed down from forgotten grandmothers. Though nothing could stop the plague, these small acts gave people a sense of control, a belief, however faint, that they could still fight back against the darkness. In this quiet war, prayer and superstition were the only armor. Quarantine and panic. As the plague spread, towns and cities began to act. Quarantine, a new word for many, became a common practice. In some regions, ships arriving at ports were made to wait offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. The number 40 had religious significance, echoing stories from scripture. If no sickness appeared during that time, the crew could come ashore. But on land, things were messier. In cities, the sick were ordered to stay indoors. Their homes were marked with red or black crosses, sometimes with a note, "Lord have mercy." Food was left at the door. In some cases, doors were nailed shut from the outside, trapping whole families inside. Guards patrolled city gates, turning away strangers. Markets were closed. Festivals were cancelled. The streets grew quiet. But fear has a way of breaking rules. Some fled to the countryside, believing open air would keep them safe. Others bribed officials to let them pass through checkpoints. Thieves took advantage of empty houses, stealing what they could before moving on. In some cities, order collapsed completely. Riots broke out over bread. In others, people simply stayed indoors, waiting in silence. The panic wasn't just about illness. It was about losing control. People no longer trusted neighbors. Friends became strangers. And yet, in some places, kindness survived. Those who had food shared it. Priests continued to visit the dying. Children cared for parents. There was still humanity in the storm. But fear was everywhere, in the eyes of merchants, the silence of the streets, the trembling hands of a widow who had seen too much. Graves, pits, and silence. The dead outnumbered the living. Churchyards quickly filled. In some towns, grave diggers worked day and night, digging hole after hole, until the earth itself seemed exhausted. The usual rituals, blessing the body, holding a funeral, placing stones or wooden crosses, were abandoned. There was no time. Instead, mass graves appeared. They were long, deep pits dug outside city walls or behind village churches. Bodies were carried in carts, wrapped in sheets or blankets, sometimes not at all. Layer upon layer, they were laid down, sprinkled with lime to mask the smell, and covered with soil. The next day, more came. The silence of burial was unlike any before. There was no mourning crowd, no weeping choir. Sometimes a single priest would whisper a prayer before moving on. In other places, even that small ritual disappeared. The earth simply closed over the dead, again and again. Some graves were marked with stones. Others were forgotten entirely. Children who survived the plague grew up passing fields that once held the bones of neighbors. They whispered stories about what lay beneath. The hills, they said, were not just made of earth, but of sorrow. And yet, life continued. Wheat grew again. Rain fell. Birds returned to empty villages. But beneath the ground, the memory of the plague remained, silent and still. What the church said. In a time of silence and sorrow, people turned to the church for answers. The church had long been the heart of medieval life. Its bells marked the hours of the day. Its priests guided births, marriages, and deaths. Its teachings shaped the understanding of the world. But when the plague came, the church itself faltered. Many priests died. They had stayed to comfort the sick, to administer last rites, to bury the dead. But the plague did not spare them. Some parishes lost all their clergy. Churches were left empty. Candles burned low in dusty chapels. Altars gathered cobwebs. Those clergy who survived faced questions they could not answer. Why had God allowed this? Was it a punishment for sin? A test of faith? A warning of the end of days? Some preachers spoke of divine wrath. They urged repentance. They called for fasting, prayer, and penance. Others preached compassion and humility, urging their flocks to help the sick, to share what little they had. Some suggested the world had fallen out of harmony, that pride, greed, and wickedness had brought this punishment upon the land. Monasteries, once places of calm and care, were overwhelmed. Monks fell ill. Nuns nursed the dying until they themselves were carried away. Sacred spaces were quiet now. The hymns of mourning were replaced by the moans of fever. Still, the faithful clung to hope. People lit candles. They placed offerings at the feet of statues. They whispered prayers in dark corners. Some joined processions, hoping to draw mercy from heaven. Others lost their faith, unable to reconcile such suffering with a just God. The church tried to hold together a world that was unraveling. In some places, it succeeded. In others, it too began to crack. But always, in times of fear, the bells rang on, calling the living to pray for the dead. Folk remedies and peasant medicine. In the absence of doctors, the people turned to each other. The peasants had always relied on traditional cures, remedies passed down by mothers, grandmothers, and village healers. These were not written in books or taught in schools. They were remembered in song, in story, in whispered advice over kitchen fires. When the plague came, these old ways returned with urgency. One remedy involved onions sliced and placed in rooms to draw out the sickness. Another required vinegar-soaked cloths tied around the ankles. Some believed that wearing a necklace of garlic or carrying a toad in a pouch could protect the wearer. Smoke was a common cure. Herbs were burned in homes and streets. People walked through clouds of rosemary, sage, or wormwood. Smoke was thought to cleanse the air, to drive away whatever unseen evil drifted through it. Healers, often women, mixed poultices of honey, mustard seed, and wild herbs. They brewed teas from yarrow, chamomile, or elderflower. They offered soothing balms for fevers and salves for swollen sores. Peasant medicine wasn't just about herbs. It was about care. A warm blanket, a bowl of broth, a lullaby sung to a child burning with fever. Even when there was little hope, these simple acts gave comfort. There were strange beliefs, too. Some thought the plague came from bad dreams, so they placed stones under their pillows. Others tied red ribbons around doors or painted charms on walls. Each village had its own customs. These cures rarely saved lives, but they gave people something to do, something to believe in. In the darkness of the plague, peasant medicine was not just healing. It was hope. Aftermath, fewer people, more power. And then, slowly, it ended. The plague did not vanish all at once. It faded like mist at dawn, here one day, gone the next, only to return in patches. But eventually, the death cart stopped. The church bells rang for weddings, not funerals. Children played again in the fields. The survivors stepped into a quieter world. Fields were overgrown. Houses were empty. In some villages, only a few families remained. The roads were lonely. The marketplaces were half-filled. But something new had begun. With fewer people, labor became more valuable. Peasants who once had little power now found themselves needed. Lords, desperate to till their lands, offered better terms. Wages rose. Serfs demanded freedom. Some left their villages to seek work elsewhere. Laws were passed to stop them, but many ignored them. The balance had shifted. A new confidence grew among the common folk. They asked questions. They made demands. They bargained. The old world of unquestioned obedience began to change. Slowly, steadily, the seeds of change were planted. Land was divided among fewer hands. Some peasants became prosperous. Others started small trades. Women, having cared for entire households during the plague, found new respect. Though sorrow lingered, the survivors were stronger. The Black Death had taken much, but it had also broken the chains of an old order. The world would never be the same again. How families recovered. Rebuilding took time. After the last plague passed through, families emerged from mourning like sprouts from winter soil. They gathered what remained. They patched roofs. They repaired tools. They cleaned out the dust and silence that had settled over their homes. Grief was everywhere. Mothers who had lost children. Children who had no parents. Brothers missing sisters. Husbands burying wives. The world had become quieter and heavier. But there was strength in togetherness. Families leaned on each other. They adopted orphans. They shared meals with widows. They welcomed distant cousins into their homes. Community ties, once stretched thin by fear, were slowly rewoven. Stories became part of healing. People remembered the ones they lost, not with tears alone, but with laughter. They spoke of their kindness, their quirks, the small joys they had brought. Names were carved into wood. Prayers were said each year on the day they died. Work returned, too. Children learned to sew, to plow, to bake. Young men married earlier than before. Women managed farms and households. With fewer people, every hand was needed. But there was pride in the work. A feeling that life, once fragile, was now precious. And so, day by day, season by season, families recovered. Not by forgetting, but by remembering, gently, memory and folklore of the plague. As years passed, the plague became a memory. It lived in stories told by elders to children, in songs sung at night, in carvings on ancient stones. It became part of the landscape, whispered about in meadows where graves once lay, or in cottages where whole families had vanished. Folk tales grew around it. They spoke of a dark mist that traveled the roads, of a woman in black who knocked on doors before the sickness came, of a bell that rang in the forest, heard only by those marked by death. Some said the plague was a spirit, angered by noise, soothed only by silence. In some places, flowers were planted where mass graves lay. In others, small shrines were built. People left offerings of bread or flowers, not out of fear, but remembrance. Generations passed. The plague remained in the lullabies mothers sang, in the saying spoken when someone sneezed, in the habit of burning herbs during illness. All quiet echoes of a time when the world stood still. It reminded people of what mattered, of kindness, of family, of resilience. And though the fear faded, the stories did not. They were passed on, gently, like seeds scattered on the wind. So even in peace, the memory of the plague lingered. A quiet lesson, wrapped in the hush of bedtime tales. Famine and the long winter. Weather and crop failures. In the medieval world, the lives of peasants were deeply intertwined with the cycles of nature. Seasons dictated everything, from planting to harvest, from feast days to fasting periods. But sometimes, nature turned harsh and unyielding. The skies remained gray. The rains fell without mercy, and the sun failed to shine. These were the years when the weather betrayed the people. Cold winds swept across the fields. Early frosts killed tender shoots. Late springs delayed planting. Fields soaked in water turned to mud. Crops that promised bread and sustenance instead rotted in the ground. The peasants' livelihood depended on these fragile harvests, and when the weather failed, so did their hopes. Crop failures were not simple losses. They meant empty granaries, starving livestock, and bellies that would grow thinner with each passing day. The fear of hunger was a shadow that stretched long across the village, darkening even the brightest days. Farmers whispered to the skies, prayed to saints, and crossed their fingers. But the crops withered and died, and the people watched as their food disappeared before their eyes. The Great Famine of 1315. One of the darkest chapters in medieval history was the Great Famine of 1315. For 3 years, from 1315 to 1317, much of Europe was gripped by a relentless hunger. It began with relentless rains. Torrential storms swept across the land, turning fields into swamps. The wheat, barley, and oats that peasants had planted drowned in the mud. The harvest failed again and again. As grain stores emptied, bread became scarce, and prices soared beyond reach. Villages faced shortages that cut deep. Livestock starved or died. Fish were caught less and less. People were forced to eat what was left, often meager and poor in nutrition. The famine was not just a lack of food. It was a crisis that shattered communities. Families faced impossible choices: which child to feed, which neighbor to turn away. Many left their homes to beg or seek work elsewhere, but the famine spread like a dark cloud, touching every corner of the land. Death rates soared. Disease followed hunger closely, preying on weakened bodies. The Great Famine left scars on the soil, on the people, and on the history of the land. Eating weeds and bark. When fields yielded no bread, peasants turned to desperate measures. They gathered wild plants, roots, and weeds, things usually left for animals. Nettles, dandelions, and wild herbs were boiled into soups. Some learned to eat roots like parsnips or wild garlic. The bark of trees became a last resort. Stripped from branches, dried, and ground into flour, tree bark was mixed with whatever grain was left to stretch the meager supply. The bark gave little nourishment but filled stomachs enough to stave off hunger pangs. Children and the elderly ate the hardest share of this strange diet. The taste was bitter, the texture coarse, but it was survival. In some places, people even ate animals not normally considered food: rats, dogs, and horses. The forest, once a source of fuel and building material, became a pantry for the starving. Though these measures kept many alive, they were not without cost. Eating wild plants and bark could cause illness. Hunger weakened bodies, and many simply could not endure. Yet, these desperate foods were a testament to human resilience, a refusal to give up even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Food riots and hunger. Hunger breeds unrest. When the food stores ran empty and prices climbed, desperation sometimes exploded into violence. Food riots broke out in towns and villages across Europe. Crowds gathered in marketplaces, shouting for bread and fairness. They targeted bakers, merchants, and even lords who were accused of hoarding grain or raising rents. Some villages saw fields trampled, granaries broken into, and food stolen under cover of night. The authorities responded harshly, trying to maintain order with guards and punishments. But the anger of the starving was difficult to contain. These food riots were more than anger. They were cries for justice. Peasants demanded access to the land, lower rents, and a chance to feed their families. Lords were forced to negotiate, sometimes lowering taxes or distributing food. But many times, the hunger remained. These moments of rebellion revealed the fragility of the medieval system and the deep pain caused by famine. Illness from rotting food. When food was scarce, the temptation to eat spoiled or rotten provisions grew. Grain that had been damp and moldy, fruit that had turned soft and fermented, meat that was bruised or rancid. These all became part of the desperate diet. Eating rotting food brought illness. Stomach pains, fevers, and diarrhea became common companions to hunger. Many fell ill from food poisoning or infections. With weakened bodies, even minor illnesses became deadly. Doctors were rare, and medicine was limited. Peasants relied on folk remedies, but these often offered little relief. The combination of famine and sickness was deadly. Hospitals and monasteries were overwhelmed. Families watched helplessly as loved ones weakened. In some places, whole communities were decimated, not just by hunger but by the diseases caused by poor food. The long winter made it worse. Cold and damp conditions spread illness more easily. Fires were difficult to keep going. The sick were isolated, sometimes left alone in small huts or barns. The shadow of disease stretched long, following famine closely. Giving to the church anyway. Despite hunger and hardship, many peasants continued to give to the church. Tithes, the church's tax of 1/10 of produce or income, were often demanded even during famine. Peasants, though starving, felt bound by faith and tradition to give what they could. Some gave their last grain, others gave labor, and some gave prayers and devotion. Church leaders preached that giving was a path to salvation, even in hard times. They promised that sacrifice would be rewarded in heaven. In monasteries, The poor were sometimes fed or cared for, but often resources were stretched thin. This tension between survival and faith was a difficult burden. Some peasants resented the demands. Others felt guilt if they could not give. Still, the church remained central to life. Its festivals, prayers, and rituals marked time and offered comfort. Even when bellies were empty, souls sought nourishment. Hope in a small harvest. Amidst the bleakness, small harvests brought glimmers of hope. A few heads of grain here, a handful of vegetables there. These small successes were celebrated quietly. Villagers shared what little they had. They helped neighbors who had nothing. These small harvests were reminders that life continued. Peasants planted hardy crops like rye or barley that could survive poor conditions. They stored seeds carefully, hoping for better seasons. They learned to adapt, rotating crops, improving soil, and watching weather signs closely. These lessons were hard-earned. But every green sprout was a promise of spring, every handful of grain a chance for survival. The long winter would end, and with it, famine would retreat. Bread lines and beggars. As hunger deepened, bread lines and begging became common sights. People who once worked the land now stood in long lines, hoping for scraps or charity. Begging was often the last resort, a sign of desperation and loss of status. Some wandered from village to village, searching for work or food. Others relied on family or neighbors for support. Charitable institutions, like monasteries and churches, tried to help. They opened almshouses and soup kitchens, though resources were scarce. Beggars were sometimes seen with suspicion or disdain, but many understood the harsh reality behind the worn clothes and empty bowls. Bread lines were quiet places, filled with patient waiting and unspoken sorrow. What children ate? Children were among the most vulnerable. Their small bodies needed nourishment to grow, yet they often received the least. When food was scarce, children ate the simplest and smallest portions. They chewed on boiled roots, leaves, or even bark. Sometimes they had thin gruel made from poor grains. Milk was rare, and meat was a luxury few could afford. Many children suffered from malnutrition, stunted growth, and illness. But still, they played. Their laughter, soft and fleeting, was a reminder of life's persistence even in dark times. Families did their best to protect them, hiding food and sharing what little they had. Children's survival was a hope for the future, a fragile light in the long winter. Songs and stories of survival. In the cold and hunger, people turned to stories and songs. Around fires, in quiet homes, they shared tales of endurance and hope. These songs told of brave ancestors, of harvests won against the odds, of the turning seasons. They soothed restless minds and warmed weary hearts. Stories spoke of kindness from neighbors, of miracles and faith, of promises that spring would return. Many were passed down from mother to child, carried in whispers and soft melodies. These songs and stories became a part of the culture, a gentle thread weaving the community together. They reminded everyone that though the winter was long, it would end. That famine, like all hardships, was a chapter, not the whole story. And so, through music and memory, peasants survived, not just in body, but in spirit. Peasant wisdom and survival skills. Saving seeds and rotating fields. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, where the fields stretched under endless skies, the peasants held knowledge that was vital for survival. One of the most important of these was saving seeds. Unlike today's modern farmers, who often buy new seeds each year, medieval peasants carefully collected seeds from their harvest. These were the lifeblood for the next planting season. Each seed was precious. After the grain was threshed and the flour ground, peasants kept a portion aside, small, hard kernels stored in clay pots or wooden boxes, protected from moisture and pests. This careful preservation meant that the fields could be replanted without relying on outside sources. But seeds were only part of the wisdom. The peasants knew that planting the same crop in the same place year after year exhausted the soil. They practiced crop rotation, moving wheat, barley, oats, and legumes around different fields in successive years to maintain fertility. Some fields were left fallow, resting for a season to recover. This knowledge was passed down from parent to child, often through hands-on work rather than written books. A young peasant might learn to recognize the best seed heads or notice subtle differences in soil texture by observing their elders. This cycle of saving seeds and rotating fields formed the backbone of medieval farming, ensuring that the community could continue to grow food year after year despite the challenges of weather and limited tools. Making do with nothing. Life for the peasant was often a lesson in making do with what little they had. Resources were scarce and expensive, so waste was not an option. From worn-out clothing patched many times over to broken tools lovingly repaired, peasants mastered the art of frugality. Broken pots were glued with pitch or sealed with clay. Old clothes became quilts or rags for cleaning. Food scraps were collected and fed to animals or saved for broth. Bones, horns, and wood scraps were fashioned into small household items, buttons, combs, or utensils. When new materials were unavailable, creativity flourished. For instance, peasants learned to soften tough grains by soaking them, or to stretch flour by mixing in ground nuts or roots. This ability to adapt was not born of choice but of necessity, and it shaped a culture of resilience. It taught patience, resourcefulness, and respect for every gift from the land. Barn knowledge and weather lore. The barn was more than a storage place. It was a center of peasant knowledge, where weather signs were read and interpreted. Peasants watched the sky for changes in color, cloud formations, and the direction of the wind. They noted the calls of birds and the behavior of animals, trusting these natural indicators to predict storms, frost, or drought. For example, a red sky at sunset often signaled fair weather, while a sudden chill or stillness could mean an approaching cold front. This weather lore was vital for planning the day's work or deciding when to plant and harvest. Such knowledge was closely held and passed down through oral tradition, stories shared around fires or in the fields. A young peasant might learn that a full moon before planting meant stronger crops, or that certain winds brought rain. This connection to the rhythms of nature gave peasants an edge in survival, allowing them to prepare for the changing seasons without modern instruments. Using the moon for planting. Many medieval peasants relied on the moon to guide their farming activities, a practice known as lunar agriculture. They believed that the phases of the moon influenced the growth of plants and the moisture in the soil. The waxing moon, when the moon's visible light increased, was thought to encourage growth and vitality, making it the ideal time for planting seeds that grow above ground, such as wheat or barley. Conversely, the waning moon was the time to plant root crops, like carrots and turnips, as it was believed to encourage root development. These ideas were linked to centuries-old traditions and folk wisdom, blending observation with a touch of mysticism. Farmers marked their calendars with moon phases, planning sowing, pruning, and harvesting according to these cycles. This lunar guidance was more than superstition. It was a practical tool that helped maximize yield and use time wisely in an uncertain world. Weaving, sewing, and mending. Clothing was precious. Peasants rarely had new garments. Instead, they wove, sewed, and mended what they had until it was threadbare. From flax and wool grown or gathered nearby, women spun thread and wove cloth on simple looms. Sewing was a daily task, patching holes, reinforcing seams, or turning old garments into new items like mittens or caps. Mending was a skill taught to children early on, becoming a rite of passage as much as a necessity. Needles were made from bone or metal scraps, and thread came from flax fibers or wool yarn. The act of mending was patient and meditative, a quiet rhythm in the busy day. It showed care for possessions and respect for the effort needed to make them. Clothes were often handed down through generations, carrying the stories of those who wore them. Healing with plants. With no doctors or pharmacies nearby, peasants turned to the natural world for healing. They gathered herbs from the wild, chamomile for calming, yarrow for wounds, nettle for blood health, and elderberry for colds. These plants were prepared as teas, poultices, or salves. Knowledge of how to use them was precious and often secret. Women, especially older ones, were healers, midwives, herbalists, and caretakers. They combined this wisdom with simple tools: knives for cutting, mortars for grinding, and cloths for bandages. Though limited compared to modern medicine, these remedies offered relief and hope. The connection between plant and healing was deep, rooted in observation and centuries of trial and error. Building homes with bare hands. Peasant homes were humble but sturdy, built with simple materials and skilled hands. Walls were made from timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud, and straw. Roofs were thatched with bundles of reeds or straw, tied tightly to keep out rain. Construction was a community effort. Neighbors gathered to help raise walls or thatch roofs, sharing tools and labor. Peasants knew how to select wood, prepare it, and join beams without nails. They made floors of packed earth or wooden planks. These homes, though modest, were warm and protected from the elements. Their building methods were passed down through generations, refined through experience and necessity. Animal care without books. Animals were essential companions for food, labor, and livelihood. Without books or manuals, peasants learned through watching and listening. They knew how to feed and shelter animals, recognize sickness, and tend wounds. Cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens were all cared for with hands-on knowledge. For example, a limp sheep might be treated with herbal poultices or rested in a clean stall. Milking cows required patience and care, ensuring animals stayed healthy and productive. This relationship between peasant and animal was close and respectful. Animals were part of the family and the economy. Community sharing. Peasant life was not solitary. Survival depended on community. Neighbors shared tools, labor, and food during hard times. When fields were plowed or harvest gathered, villagers worked together in groups known as work gangs. Sharing extended to knowledge, advice on planting, medicine, and repair was freely given. Communal ovens and mills were places of gathering and cooperation. This sharing built trust and strengthened bonds. In times of famine or illness, community support could mean the difference between life and death. Passing knowledge in story. Without schools or books, peasants preserved their wisdom through stories. Tales were told by elders around fires, on long winter nights, or during communal work. Stories taught lessons about crops, weather, animals, and human nature. They included warnings of dangers, celebrations of heroes, and explanations of natural phenomena. Storytelling was a way to remember and honor the past. It kept alive the connection between generations. These stories were the heart of peasant culture, weaving knowledge and identity into the fabric of daily life. The church and the spirit. Faith as comfort. In the heart of every medieval village stood the church, a sturdy, humble building made of stone or wood, with a simple bell tower that called people to worship. For peasants, the church was more than just a place to pray. It was a refuge in times of hardship, a source of comfort amidst the uncertainty of daily life. The Middle Ages were a period marked by plagues, famines, wars, and relentless labor. For peasants, life was unpredictable and often harsh. Their faith provided a steady beacon of hope, a way to make sense of suffering and a promise of something better beyond this world. Attending church services was a weekly ritual. It was a time to come together, to feel connected to a larger community, and to find solace in shared prayers and hymns. The sermons, though delivered in Latin, spoke through ritual and symbolism, reminding everyone that they were part of God's grand plan. Faith encouraged patience, humility, and endurance. It was believed that earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven. This belief gave peasants a sense of purpose and a spiritual strength that helped them face daily struggles. Fear of hell and hope of heaven. Medieval Christians lived with a profound awareness of the afterlife. The teachings of the church painted vivid pictures of heaven and hell, serving both as a source of hope and a powerful deterrent. Hell was described as a place of eternal fire and torment for sinners, a warning that instilled fear and urged moral behavior. The possibility of damnation weighed heavily on the minds of peasants, encouraging them to follow the church's rules and confess their sins regularly. At the same time, the promise of heaven offered comfort and joy. Heaven was depicted as a paradise of peace, light, and eternal happiness, where faithful souls would be reunited with God and their loved ones. This dual message of fear and hope shaped much of peasant life. It inspired acts of charity, devotion, and repentance. Even in the darkest moments, peasants clung to the hope of salvation and the dream of eternal peace. Paying the tithe. The church played a significant role in the economic life of the village. One of the ways peasants contributed was through the tithe, a tax amounting to 1/10 of their produce or income. Paying the tithe was not optional. It was a religious obligation that supported the local clergy, maintained the church building, and funded charitable works. For many peasants, this was a heavy burden, especially in years of poor harvests or famine. They would gather a portion of their grain, eggs, or livestock to give to the church. Some paid in money, but barter was common in rural areas. Despite the difficulty, paying the tithe was also seen as a way to show devotion and gain favor in the eyes of God. It was believed that generosity to the church would bring blessings to their fields and families. Attending Mass in Latin. Mass was the centerpiece of religious life, but it came with a challenge. Most peasants did not understand Latin, the language in which it was conducted. The priest performed the Mass with solemn chants and rituals, reading from sacred texts and reciting prayers in a language unfamiliar to the common folk. For peasants, the experience of Mass was sensory and symbolic. The smell of burning incense, the flickering candlelight, the ringing of bells, and the sight of holy images and relics created a powerful atmosphere. Many learned the key prayers by heart, and some understood parts of the service through catechism lessons or sermons in the local tongue. Despite the language barrier, Mass was a unifying experience, a shared moment of faith that connected the community to God and each other. Confession and forgiveness. Confession was a vital sacrament in medieval Christianity, offering peasants a way to seek forgiveness and reconcile with God. Peasants visited the confessional booth or a quiet corner of the church to confess their sins to the parish priest. These sins could be anything from stealing a neighbor's goods to failing to attend Mass. The priest would listen, offer counsel, and assign penance, acts of prayer, fasting, or good deeds to atone for the sins. Confession was a deeply personal and sometimes fearful experience. Peasants worried about revealing their faults, but it was also a source of relief and spiritual cleansing. Forgiveness restored peace to the soul, strengthening faith and moral resolve. It reminded peasants that no matter their mistakes, grace was always within reach. Pilgrimage for the poor. Though pilgrimages to distant holy sites were costly and difficult, many peasants dreamed of making such journeys to deepen their faith. For the poor, shorter pilgrimages to local shrines or relics were more common. These trips were acts of devotion, seeking healing, blessings, or indulgences, remissions of penance granted by the church. Pilgrimages were both spiritual and social events, involving travel through the countryside, encounters with other pilgrims, and shared prayers. Even the preparation, saving food, repairing shoes, and gathering a small group, was a demonstration of faith and determination. These journeys connected peasants to the wider Christian world and reinforced the communal aspects of their belief. Saints, candles, and miracles. Saints held a special place in medieval peasant spirituality. These holy men and women were believed to intercede with God on behalf of the living. Peasants prayed to specific saints for protection, healing, or help with daily troubles. Saint Anthony was called upon for lost items, Saint George for courage, and Saint Anne for childbirth. Candles were lit before statues or relics as offerings, symbolizing prayer and hope. Stories of miracles, healing, visions, or divine interventions were told and retold, inspiring faith and wonder. These practices created a rich spiritual landscape filled with meaning and comfort. The churchyard as a meeting place. Beyond worship, the churchyard was a central gathering place for the village. Here, people met to talk, share news, arrange marriages, and hold fairs. It was a space of social life, where sacred and everyday mingled. Children played among the gravestones, while elders exchanged stories and advice. The churchyard connected the living to the dead, reminding peasants of their place in the cycle of life. The role of the parish priest. The parish priest was a key figure in village life. He was not only a spiritual leader but often a teacher, healer, and counselor. Priests conducted baptisms, marriages, and funerals, marking the major life events of the community. They provided guidance in times of doubt or trouble and sometimes acted as mediators in disputes. The priest's presence was a constant reassurance, a link between the earthly and the divine. Though many priests were poor and lived modestly, their role was respected and valued. Death and the afterlife beliefs. Death was a constant companion in medieval times, and beliefs about the afterlife shaped how peasants lived and died. Funerals were solemn occasions with prayers for the soul's journey. Peasants believed in purgatory, a place of temporary purification before entering heaven. Masses and prayers were said to help the dead find peace and avoid eternal damnation. These rituals provided comfort to the living, affirming that death was not an end, but a passage. Hope in the afterlife was a powerful force, encouraging faithfulness and offering peace amid life's hardships. Peasant women, backbone of the village. The life of a peasant wife. In medieval Europe, the peasant wife was truly the backbone of village life. Her day began before dawn and often ended after the last light faded. Unlike noblewomen, who had servants and fewer daily tasks, peasant wives were the heart and hands of the household. They balanced endless chores with the care of children, tending to animals, and helping in the fields. The life of a peasant wife was defined by hard labor and resilience. From grinding grain to baking bread, from fetching water to preparing meals, every task was necessary for survival. She had to be resourceful, making the most out of what little the family owned. The success of the household often depended on her skill and endurance. These women lived in modest cottages made of wood or wattle and daub, with little furniture, and often just 1 or 2 rooms. Heating came from a central hearth, and all members of the family gathered around it not just for warmth, but for cooking and socializing. The peasant wife's role was to manage this hearth, both literally and figuratively, keeping the home running. Yet, despite the heavy burden of daily work, peasant wives found moments of joy and community. They shared stories and songs with neighbors, supported each other during hard times, and passed down traditions from generation to generation. Their laughter and tears shaped the rhythm of village life. Birth without doctors. Childbirth in medieval villages was an event marked by bravery and community support, but it was also fraught with danger. Unlike the wealthy who might afford midwives or even doctors, most peasant women gave birth at home, assisted by female relatives, neighbors, or an experienced midwife if available. Medical knowledge was limited, and childbirth was one of the greatest risks for peasant women. Many did not survive complications such as infections, hemorrhages, or prolonged labor. However, the village midwife's role was crucial. She used herbal remedies passed down through generations, such as chamomile to ease pain or raspberry leaf tea to strengthen the uterus, and her hands were skilled in helping the baby into the world. During labor, women gathered around the mother-to-be, offering comfort, prayers, and encouragement. It was a communal act, with deep spiritual and social significance. The birth was not just the arrival of a new life, but also a moment that reinforced bonds within the community. Though risky, childbirth was also surrounded by customs and rituals intended to protect mother and child from evil spirits. For instance, placing iron scissors under the bed or reciting prayers were believed to shield both from harm. These practices reflected the blend of faith, superstition, and practical knowledge that defined peasant life. Weaving, cooking, and child-rearing. Weaving was more than just a craft for peasant women. It was a vital skill that helped keep the family clothed and sometimes provided a little extra income. From flax to wool, peasant women knew how to spin fibers into thread using a spinning wheel or drop spindle. Then they wove these threads into cloth on a loom, often right inside their small homes. The work was painstaking and required patience, but clothing was essential not only for warmth but also as a symbol of the family's status within the village. A woman's skill with her loom was a point of pride and could influence marriage prospects for her daughters. Cooking was another demanding part of daily life. Peasant women prepared food with simple ingredients, mostly grains, vegetables, and whatever meat was available. Their meals were humble: pottage, a thick stew, coarse bread, and seasonal fruits or vegetables. Preservation techniques, such as smoking or salting meat, were crucial to stretch resources through the winter. Child-rearing was intertwined with all these tasks. From infancy to early childhood, children were close to their mothers, learning by watching and helping with chores. Peasant women taught their children essential survival skills: how to tend animals, plant crops, or recognize useful herbs. Mothers also passed down stories, songs, and religious lessons, which shaped the children's understanding of the world. Despite the hard work, there was tenderness and deep affection. Peasant women's love and care were the foundation of village continuity and strength. Working in the fields. Peasant women were often expected to join men in the fields, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Their labor was indispensable. Without their hands helping sow seeds, tend crops, and gather the harvest, survival would have been impossible. Working in the fields meant long hours under the sun, often bending, weeding, and carrying heavy loads. This was exhausting physical labor, made even harder by the constant threat of bad weather or poor soil. Women also helped with threshing grain, a back-breaking process that separated edible parts from chaff. Sometimes they carried baskets of produce to market or to the lord's manor as rent payment. Despite the hard toil, working in the fields also fostered a sense of camaraderie among women. They shared stories, joked, and supported one another through tough days. The fields were not just a place of work but also a social space where bonds were formed and strengthened. Herbal wisdom passed down. Peasant women were the keepers of a vast, practical knowledge of herbs and plants that grew wild around them. This wisdom was handed down from mother to daughter, often orally, with no written records but a deep respect for nature's healing power. In an age when doctors were rare and often inaccessible to the poor, this knowledge was life-saving. From chamomile to soothe stomach aches, to yarrow to stop bleeding, these plants were the pharmacy of the village. Women learned when and how to harvest these herbs, the right time of day, the proper way to dry leaves, and how to prepare infusions, poultices, and salves. Herbal remedies were used not just for physical ailments but also for spiritual protection. Women would carry sprigs of rosemary for remembrance or burn sage to cleanse a sick room. This connection to nature created a bond between peasant women and the earth, reinforcing their role as nurturers and healers. Widows and women alone. Life could be especially harsh for widows or women whose husbands were away at war or had died from disease. Without the support of a male head of household, many peasant women faced poverty and social vulnerability. However, widows often took on roles that went beyond the household. Some managed farms, negotiated with lords, or ran small businesses like selling dairy products or homemade cloth. These women showed remarkable resilience and independence, carving out spaces of power within the strict medieval hierarchy. The community sometimes viewed widows with suspicion, especially if they were wealthy or outspoken, but many were respected for their strength and wisdom. Being alone forced peasant women to adapt in creative ways to survive and protect their families. Girls at work. From a young age, girls in medieval villages were trained to help with household and farm tasks. Play was limited, as every hand was needed. Learning to weave, cook, tend animals, and care for younger siblings was part of their education. Girls also learned social skills, how to cooperate with other village women, prepare for marriage, and eventually raise their own families. The early years were both a time of learning and of responsibility, with little room for idleness. However, despite their hard work, girls also found joy in friendships, festivals, and storytelling. These moments of reprieve were vital in shaping strong, capable women who would carry the village forward. Marriage and family roles. Marriage in medieval peasant society was both a personal and economic contract. Families arranged marriages to secure alliances, share resources, and ensure survival. Peasant wives were expected to bear children, manage the household, and contribute labor. Gender roles were clear but also flexible depending on necessity. While men usually handled plowing and heavy labor, women's work was no less essential. The couple often worked side by side, with shared goals and mutual dependence. Family roles extended beyond the nuclear family. Extended relatives lived nearby, helping raise children and manage resources. The peasant family was a tightly knit unit, where cooperation was crucial for enduring the hardships of medieval life. Strength in silence. Peasant women often bore immense burdens quietly, their struggles unseen by those outside the village. The hardships of poverty, disease, loss, and endless labor required a strength that was both physical and emotional. In a world where speaking out could invite punishment or social scorn, many women found ways to endure in silence. Their resilience was a silent force that kept villages alive and communities functioning. Yet silence did not mean submission. In subtle ways, through stories, songs, and rituals, women expressed their hopes, fears, and resistance. Their quiet courage shaped the history of medieval life as much as the battles and laws written by men. Women in folklore. The stories and legends told in medieval villages often featured women as symbols of wisdom, power, and mystery. From the clever peasant girl who outwitted a lord to the wise healer who protected the community, women's roles in folklore reflected both admiration and caution. These tales were more than entertainment. They carried lessons about survival, morality, and the balance of power. Women in folklore embodied the strengths and challenges of real peasant women, preserving their legacy in a world that often overlooked them. Through oral tradition, these stories traveled from village to village, reinforcing a shared identity and cultural memory that honored the backbone of medieval society, its women. Community, folklore, and togetherness. In the life of medieval peasants, community was the heart of survival. When individuals faced the harsh realities of poverty, famine, disease, and the ever-looming threats from lords or invaders, it was the strength of their community and shared traditions that provided comfort, identity, and resilience. This heading explores the vibrant tapestry of communal life, from festivals and taverns to folklore and the unspoken bonds that held villages together. Festivals and simple joys. Despite the grueling labor and endless challenges, medieval peasants found moments of joy and celebration. Festivals were a vital part of village life, marking the changing seasons, religious holy days, and important agricultural milestones. The calendar was dotted with these communal events, from harvest festivals to saints' days and the raucous May Day celebrations. People would gather in the village square, dressed in their best, bringing whatever food or drink they could spare. Music, dancing, and storytelling were common, and these festivals were a rare chance to relax and connect. Simple joys, like the taste of fresh bread after a long winter, the warmth of a bonfire, or the laughter of children playing games, were cherished deeply. These moments reminded peasants that even in hardship, life had sweetness worth celebrating. Gathering at the tavern. The tavern or alehouse was more than just a place to drink. It was the social hub of the village. Here, men and women gathered after a hard day's work to share news, gossip, and stories. Ale was brewed locally, often weaker than the strong brews of nobles but still a welcome comfort. The tavern was a place to unwind, to find camaraderie, and sometimes to plan collective actions like petitions or resistance to lords' demands. Songs were sung, jokes told, and friendships forged in these smoky, dimly lit rooms. For peasants who toiled in isolation, the tavern provided a sense of belonging and a vital social network. Sharing tools and labor. Survival in a medieval village was a collective effort. Few peasants owned all the tools needed for farming or building, so sharing was essential. A plough might be used by several families throughout the season, and neighbors would help each other during planting or harvest. Labor sharing extended to barn raising, repairing fences, and tending to livestock. These communal tasks reinforced bonds and ensured that no family was left to face hardship alone. This spirit of cooperation was both practical and social. It built trust, allowed skills to be passed down, and created a safety net in times of crisis. Seasonal traditions. The rhythm of peasant life followed the seasons closely. Every part of the year brought its own traditions and rituals tied to farming cycles, weather changes, and religious observances. Spring planting was a hopeful time, often accompanied by small blessings or offerings to ensure a good crop. Autumn harvests were celebrated with feasts, prayers, and festivals. Winter was quieter, with indoor crafts, storytelling, and preparation for the coming cold. These traditions, both sacred and secular, connected peasants to the land, the divine, and each other. Legends of forest spirits. Medieval peasants lived close to nature, and their folklore reflects a world alive with spirits and magic. Forests, rivers, and hills were not just physical places but realms inhabited by mysterious beings, fairies, sprites, and protective spirits. Stories of these beings were told to explain natural phenomena, warn children, or teach moral lessons. Some spirits were thought to be kind and helpful, others dangerous and vengeful. These legends shaped the villagers' relationship with their environment, encouraging respect and caution in equal measure. Superstitions and daily rituals. Superstition permeated daily life. Peasants often performed small rituals to ward off evil or bring good fortune, like carrying charms, knocking on wood, or avoiding certain words. These practices mixed Christian beliefs with older pagan traditions, creating a rich tapestry of spiritual life that gave meaning and control over the unpredictable world. Simple acts, blessing seeds before planting, leaving bread for household spirits, or making signs of the cross, offered comfort and a sense of agency. Passing down tales. Oral tradition was the main way history, culture, and knowledge were preserved and shared. Storytelling was an art, with elders recounting tales of heroes, gods, and ancestors. These stories served many purposes: entertainment, education, moral instruction, and community bonding. They connected generations, teaching younger villagers about the values and experiences of their people. Tales were told at night by the fire, in the tavern, or during festivals, always evolving but preserving the core of peasant identity. Singing while working. Music was woven into the fabric of daily life. Work songs helped synchronize labor in the fields, making repetitive tasks more bearable. Singing also lifted spirits and reinforced group cohesion. Many songs told stories of love, loss, humor, or heroic deeds. Some were passed down from generations. Others were improvised to reflect current events or local personalities. This musical tradition kept morale high and ensured that even hard work was not without joy. Storytelling by candlelight. As daylight faded, villagers gathered in homes around flickering candlelight or hearth fires. This was a sacred time for storytelling, where history mingled with myth and legend. The oral narrative shaped the community's worldview, linking past to present and reinforcing cultural norms. Stories told here were intimate, shared among neighbors and family members, often with lessons about virtue, bravery, and resilience. The darkness outside contrasted with the warmth and light inside, symbolizing hope and continuity amid hardship. The strength of the village. Ultimately, the medieval peasant's greatest asset was the village itself, a network of mutual support, shared hardship, and collective memory. Togetherness was survival. Villagers pooled resources, cared for the sick, buried the dead, and celebrated births. They defended each other from external threats and navigated the complex social order imposed by lords and the church. This collective strength was not just practical but deeply emotional and spiritual, a reminder that even in the bleakest times, human connection and community endured. The peasant's plough. In the quiet rhythm of medieval village life, there was perhaps no tool more symbolic and essential than the plough. For a medieval peasant, the plough was not just a farming implement. It was a lifeline. The landscape, with its heavy clay soils and unpredictable weather, could only be tamed with steady persistence and the right tools, and chief among them was the plough. Most peasants did not own their own ploughs. Instead, the village community might share one or two, managed either collectively or by the wealthier tenants. Constructed primarily from wood, these ploughs had iron-tipped blades known as coulters, which could slice into the dense soil. In earlier centuries, the scratch plough, a simple wooden contraption, was used in lighter soils, but as agriculture progressed, heavier moldboard ploughs became necessary to turn the thick soils of northern Europe. These ploughs were typically drawn by oxen, slow but sturdy creatures capable of pulling the heavy wooden frame across furrowed fields. A peasant family with even a pair of oxen was considered fortunate. Often, several families would pool their animals together just to make the task of ploughing feasible. Cooperation was not a luxury in medieval village life. It was a necessity. The act of ploughing itself was more than just labor. It was spiritual. The furrow cut by the plough opened the earth like a page, ready for the story of the harvest to be written. Each furrow was made with a silent hope that the rains would come, that the sun would follow, and that the harvest would be enough to feed one's family and satisfy the Lord's dues. Children watched carefully as their fathers worked the fields, learning not just how to hold the plough steady, but how to judge the feel of the earth, how to align the oxen, how to navigate the ancient stones buried deep beneath the topsoil. There were no manuals, only memory, passed down with patient guidance. During the planting season, the village fields were alive with the groaning of harnesses, the cries of encouragement to the animals, and the creak of wooden wheels pressing against the soil. It was a time of collective purpose, when each turn of the plough brought the villagers one step closer to security. And it was a season filled with quiet tension, too. If the plough broke or if the soil was too dry or too waterlogged, it could mean disaster months later. Maintaining the plough was part of the peasants' yearly cycle. Iron parts were sharpened by the local blacksmith, who was paid in grain or labor. Wooden parts were replaced or repaired with hand tools, hatchets, wedges, and hammers, all crafted or traded for within the community. When not in use, the plough was stored in the barn, carefully kept dry to preserve the wood. To modern eyes, the plough may seem simple, even crude. But to a medieval peasant, it was an instrument of survival, deeply tied to their physical and spiritual lives. It was the beginning of every loaf of bread, the hidden power behind every meal, and the silent force that shaped the seasons of their lives. Mud walls and straw roofs. The homes of medieval peasants were not grand structures, but they were shelters shaped by hands that knew survival. Built from what the land offered, mud, straw, timber, and stone. These homes stood as quiet testaments to ingenuity in the face of hardship. Walls were made with a method known as wattle and daub. First, a framework of woven wooden strips, the wattle, was set in place. Then, this lattice was packed and coated with a mixture of mud, clay, animal dung, and straw, the daub. It dried into a surprisingly durable wall, though it required frequent repair, especially after heavy rains or frost. The smell of fresh daub, earthy and pungent, filled the village during construction. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept out the wind. Roofs were layered thick with thatch, bundles of straw laid carefully, overlapping like scales. These straw roofs, golden in the sun and dark in the rain, required skill to lay correctly. Poorly laid thatch leaked, and leaking roofs meant damp floors, mold, and illness. Children often slept directly under the thatch, and sometimes birds or insects would burrow in, causing rustling sounds at night that merged with the wind's howl. Inside, the floors were often nothing more than hardened earth. Rushes or straw were scattered to make them softer underfoot, but over time these mingled with food scraps, animal fur, and soot. Homes were dark, with little natural light. Windows were tiny and sometimes covered with animal bladder or cloth instead of glass. Despite their simplicity, these structures were warm in winter and cool in summer, if maintained. Repairs were constant. After storms or deep freezes, entire sections might need redaubing. Peasant families often worked together, raising walls and patching roofs communally. It was slow work, but filled with laughter, storytelling, and shared meals. Every home bore the mark of its builder, a slightly crooked doorway here, a smoke-stained beam there. These imperfections gave each house its own personality, and in the quiet of the evening, when firelight flickered against the mud walls, there was comfort in knowing that this shelter, humble as it was, had been made with one's own hands. Shared wells and communal ovens. In the center of most medieval villages stood a well, not just a source of water but a place where life gathered. Shared by all, the well was dug deep, reinforced with stone or timber, and carefully maintained. Drawing water from it was part of daily routine, often the work of women and children. They carried wooden buckets with ropes, balanced them with yokes across their shoulders, and chatted while waiting their turn. Fetching water wasn't always quick or easy. In times of drought, the line grew long. In winter, frozen ropes bit into fingers. Yet it was around this well that gossip flowed, marriages were arranged, and songs were sung. The well served not just bodies but the spirit of the village. Likewise, many villages had a communal oven, a large, dome-shaped structure made from clay or stone where bread was baked in batches. Peasants couldn't afford their own ovens, so they brought dough wrapped in cloth or stored in baskets, marked with unique symbols so the loaves wouldn't be mixed up. The oven keeper, often an elder or a widow, managed the fire and the baking schedule. Baking day was special. The scent of warm bread drifted through the lanes. Families stood by, waiting, laughing, sharing news. It was an act of patience and unity. Some even exchanged favors. You help me harvest, I'll bake your bread next week. These communal spaces were more than functional. They were the true heartbeat of togetherness. Stone, wood, and earth. Peasants built their world from the elements beneath their feet. Stone for the foundations, wood for the beams, and earth for the walls. Trees were carefully chosen, oak for strength, ash for flexibility. Wood was carved by hand with tools passed down through generations, often worn smooth from decades of use. Stones were gathered from fields, cleared so crops could grow. Larger ones were used to line the base of homes or create simple boundary walls. Villagers developed strong backs and clever techniques for moving them, using sleds, logs, and ropes. Earth, the most abundant material, was both friend and foe. It offered clay for walls, mud for repairs, and turf for insulation. But it also turned to sludge in the rains and cracked in drought. Peasants learned to read the land, which soil held strongest, which crumbled, which stained walls prettily after drying. Even tools were made from these materials. Wooden rakes, stone knives, plows with iron tips. Their connection to the land was total. When they shaped their homes, they shaped themselves, rough, enduring, grounded in nature's rawest gifts. Barns, pens, and livestock. Beyond the living quarters, every peasant home had a collection of functional spaces. The barn, the animal pen, the shed. These structures were essential, not just as storage but as survival engines. In the barn, hay was stacked high to feed animals through winter. Tools were hung, repaired, shared. Sometimes, children slept there, especially in harvest season. Livestock was the village's treasure. Chickens scratched in the dirt, pigs rooted near the edges, cows lowed in the morning mist. Pens were built from wood or stone, rough and simple, but always maintained. A broken fence meant a lost pig or worse, a neighbor's wrath. Peasants knew every sound their animals made. A change in bleating or squealing meant illness. They knew when a sheep was ready to lamb or when a hen would stop laying. Animal care was not learned from books but from mothers, grandfathers, neighbors. Losing an animal was devastating. It wasn't just food or milk, but a lifeline. GHT. Sounds from the barn were like lullabies. The shifting of straw, the occasional grunt or cluck, the soft breath of cows in the cold. These noises reminded peasants that though life was hard, it pulsed on. Smells, sounds, and rhythm. Medieval village life wasn't quiet or clean, but it had its own rhythm, familiar, earthy, and real. The scent of dung mixed with firewood, the tang of sweat and livestock, the sweet moment of bread baking or herbs boiling. To an outsider, the village may have seemed foul-smelling, but to those who lived in it, every smell told a story. Sounds wove through the day. Roosters crowed at dawn, children laughed or cried, hammers struck, water splashed, songs drifted on the breeze. At night, dogs barked faintly, owls hooted, lovers whispered under thatched eaves. It was never truly silent. And through all this, a rhythm held. Wake at sunrise, tend animals, eat, labor, return, sleep. Seasons bent this pattern. Spring rushed with planting, autumn with harvest, winter with waiting. But the rhythm was steady, passed down like old boots or copper pots. It gave structure to chaos and peace to long, difficult days. Shoes made of rope. Few peasants could afford leather boots. Most wore shoes made from rope, woven tightly from hemp or straw. These were called sabatons or simply sandals, and while they offered little protection, they were better than bare feet on frozen ground or thorny paths. Crafting them was a skill, passed on by grandmothers and uncles who knew the exact tension needed to prevent blisters. Some peasants stuffed moss inside for softness, others lined them with wool if they had it. They wore out fast and were patched, repatched, or replaced. Children often went barefoot, except in snow. In markets or church, wearing shoes was a sign of dignity. Peasants might keep one good pair, handed down, polished with pig fat, worn carefully. Walking miles in such footwear was normal. Fields lay far, forests farther, and visits to kin meant aching feet. But peasants walked with purpose, used to the road, knowing the terrain like the lines in their palms. Washing in streams. With no running water in homes, peasants bathed in streams and rivers. Washing wasn't daily, water was precious, and winters made it painful. But cleanliness was still valued. On feast days, before weddings, or after planting season, people gathered at the stream to scrub off mud, sweat, and dust. Clothes were pounded with stones or scrubbed with sand and soaked in ash water or lye. Soap, if used, was homemade, a mix of fat and ashes, sharp on the skin. Women sang while washing, trading news across the flowing current. Modesty mattered. Men and women washed separately or at different times. Bathing was public, but discreet. The water was often brown with earth, and fish darted between legs. Despite the chill, the stream was a place of refreshment, a temporary escape, a cleanse of more than just the body. In the shimmer of light on water, peasants saw a moment of beauty, a glimmer of the sacred. The hearth as the heart. At the center of every home was the hearth. Not just a place to cook, but a place to live. Fire was life. It provided warmth, light, and protection. The hearth glowed through the darkest nights, its embers symbols of continuity. Meals were cooked in iron pots suspended above the fire. Stews simmered for hours, flavored with turnips, barley, and wild herbs. Children sat close, warming hands, roasting apples, listening to stories. Elders told of hard winters and kinder springs, all by firelight. Ashes were carefully managed, used in cleaning, gardening, even wound care. Peasants respected fire's power. A spark on a dry roof could ruin a village. Around the hearth, families prayed, laughed, argued. It was the confessional, the council hall, the cradle. When a new baby arrived, the fire welcomed it. When someone died, the fire burned in mourning. In that flickering light, the soul of the peasant home was most visible, fragile, fierce, and full of hope. Seasonal changes in the home. The peasant home shifted with the seasons. In winter, straw was stuffed in cracks to keep out wind. Extra blankets, often just old cloaks, were piled high. Animals sometimes slept indoors for warmth, filling the house with breath and life. In spring, walls were redaubed, roofs patched. Windows were opened, letting in bees, sunshine, and dust. Summer meant work, long days, short nights, heat thick in the thatch. Doors were left open, meals eaten outside. Autumn brought the harvest, and homes filled with its bounty. Apples dried near the fire. Herbs hung from beams. Grain was stored in sacks, mushrooms strung into garlands. Peasants adapted their space constantly. Beds were moved, tools shifted, floors recovered. It was a dance with the earth. The walls may not have changed, but the way the space breathed and lived was always evolving. Each season brought hardships, but also small joys. The smell of fresh-cut hay, the sound of rain on thatch, the hush of snowfall. These rhythms stitched themselves into the walls, into the lives of those who called the village home. Legacy and memory of peasant life. Oral traditions and folk tales. Long before the written word reached the hearths of peasants, stories lived in the air, passed from lips to eager ears. Oral tradition was the lifeblood of memory in the medieval village, a glowing thread that tied the old to the young, the living to the dead, and the known world to the unseen beyond the woods. These tales were more than entertainment. They were repositories of values, warnings, laughter, and identity. Around the fire, after long days in the field, elders would recount stories of clever foxes, talking trees, or saints who walked through storms. Each tale had a purpose: to teach obedience, to explain strange weather, to reinforce community bonds. Don't walk near the pond at night. The spirit of the drowned woman waits, a grandmother might warn. Was it true? It didn't matter. The story kept children safe, close to home, and gave shape to mystery. Some tales were rooted in history, memories of famine, wars, or great migrations turned into legend. Others were pure invention, shaped by humor and hope. Heroes weren't kings or knights. They were farmers who tricked tax collectors, widows who outwitted wolves, or orphans who found treasure beneath the hearthstone. These stories changed with the teller. A tale in one village differed from the same tale across the hill. Details shifted, names altered, morals adjusted. This fluidity kept the stories alive, fresh, relevant to each new generation. Memory didn't need parchment. It needed voices. Even rituals came wrapped in story. The way to plant garlic under a full moon, or to chase away illness with broomsticks and song. Each act steeped in inherited tale. These oral customs preserved wisdom that books would later dismiss as superstition. Yet many held kernels of truth. Knowledge of the seasons, healing herbs, and the human psyche. What remains of these stories today lingers faintly in nursery rhymes, village festivals, and local sayings. As sly as a winter fox, someone might say, not knowing the tale behind it. But the story still breathes. In every modern campfire tale, in every lullaby passed between generations, the voice of the medieval peasant echoes softly. Their stories never truly vanished. They found new homes in hearts across centuries. Songs sung in fields. In the quiet rhythm of peasant life, songs were as common as the wind. As peasants toiled in fields from dawn till dusk, music became both a tool and a balm. These were not formal compositions or learned verses, but raw, earthy melodies shaped by toil, weather, and longing. They were hummed beneath breath while planting, sung loudly at harvest, and whispered during moments of solitude. Work songs often mirrored the motions of labor. A steady beat helped coordinate a group lifting hay, guiding oxen, or swinging sickles. The rhythm wasn't just music. It was efficiency, focus, unity. Some songs had refrains, allowing even children to join in. Others were call and response, echoing through fields and creating a sense of togetherness. Lyrics drew from life, praise for the sun, laments for the rain, humor about a stubborn mule or lazy neighbor, or dreams of full bellies and warm beds. Even sorrow had its melody. Songs mourned lost children, failing crops, or the absence of a loved one taken by war or plague. Yet, in singing, pain found release. Music stitched the personal to the communal. Seasonal songs marked transitions. Planting in spring, reaping in fall, resting in winter. These tunes were passed down with the same care as seeds and stories, often remembered better than any prayer. Some melodies were shared across regions, others unique to a single village. And like folklore, they adapted over time. In some parts of Europe, traveling minstrels would pick up these peasant tunes and carry them afar, changing their shape, but keeping their spirit alive. Eventually, fragments of these field songs seeped into ballads and lullabies that lasted centuries. Today, ethnomusicologists still trace elements of modern folk songs back to medieval fields. The cadence, the themes, the heart of those ancient laborists singing under the same sky we see now, they endure. Superstitions and ancient wisdom. In the heart of every medieval peasant lay a belief in unseen forces. These weren't empty fears but inherited knowledge, woven from generations who had watched the world shift and ripple in mysterious ways. Superstition filled the gaps where science had not yet tread, and in its place, peasants developed a complex tapestry of ritual, caution, and whispered wisdom. A rooster crowing at dusk meant death was near. A sneeze before breakfast brought luck, but one after meant disappointment. Knocking on wood, crossing fingers, or hanging herbs by the door weren't habits. They were survival. Each gesture was a shield against the randomness of nature and fate. Witches were feared and sometimes revered. A woman with knowledge of herbs, animals, and weather was both healer and potential threat. Villagers would seek her help for childbirth, sickness, or curses, but might later blame her if crops failed. This duality kept communities watchful and bound to tradition. The moon governed planting. Stars signaled change. Cats, especially black ones, were either omens or protectors, depending on local law. Bread falling butter side down meant a quarrel was coming. Spilled salt had to be thrown over the shoulder. These weren't trivial beliefs. They anchored daily life. Even illness had supernatural explanations. A cow's sudden death wasn't just disease. It might be an angry spirit. A child's fever could be caused by a fairy's touch. Remedies blended faith and folklore. A prayer here, a poultice there, and a charm hung over the bed. Superstitions reflected a deep respect for nature's unpredictability. In a world without weather forecasts or medical knowledge, peasants turned to signs and stories. They listened to the land, the sky, and their elders. Modern eyes may dismiss these beliefs, yet their endurance speaks volumes. Many traditions persist today in rituals we perform without thinking. They're echoes of a past where wisdom and wonder were one. The roots of regional dialects. In a world without maps or mass media, language grew like the crops, locally, uniquely, and richly. Each village or valley developed its own rhythm of speech. Dialects weren't just variations in vocabulary, but living markers of history, migration, and survival. The medieval peasant spoke a tongue shaped by conquerors, traders, and neighbors. Latin, Old Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, all left their fingerprints on local speech. A plough might be called one thing in the south and another in the north. Even names for weather, tools, migration, and survival. The medieval peasant spoke a tongue shaped by conquerors, traders, and neighbors. Latin, Old Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, all left their fingerprints on local speech. A plough might be called one thing in the south and another in the north. Even names for weather, tools, or kinship changed with the terrain. These differences weren't errors or corruption, they were adaptations. Language bent to fit the needs of people who had no formal schooling but rich oral traditions. Words carried meaning, mood, and music. Some dialects even had distinct ways of blessing a field, calling livestock, or mourning the dead. Stories passed down in these dialects preserved more than folklore. They preserved a worldview. The cadence of a tale, the word for ghost, or the insult shouted at a lazy ox reflected centuries of lived experience. As literacy spread and standard languages emerged, many dialects began to fade. But echoes remain in idioms, surnames, and place names. Linguists still study these regional tongues to understand medieval life. In them, we hear the peasants not just speaking, but living. Today, some communities revive these dialects, proud of their distinct voice. They recognize what peasants once knew instinctively, that language, like soil, carries memory, literacy, and learning. The average peasant could not read or write, but that did not mean they were without learning. Knowledge came through songs, rhymes, and memory. Still, by the end of the Middle Ages, schools for boys, not just nobles, began to appear, often tied to churches. A handful of peasant children were sent to learn their letters. Monks copied books painstakingly by hand, and these books, once treasures only for kings and bishops, began to find their way to wealthier parishes. The invention of the printing press was still in the future, but its shadow was growing. In time, peasants would hear of it, and the written word would become not just a noble's tool, but a bridge to power for even the humblest hand. Medieval timekeeping and the church bells. In a world without wristwatches, smartphones, or digital clocks, medieval peasants lived by a different rhythm, one dictated by nature, toil, and the bells of the church. Time in the village was not counted in minutes but in tasks: milking cows, tilling fields, baking bread, feeding animals. The passage of time was marked by sunrise and sunset, the lengthening shadows, and the crowing of the rooster. But the most prominent signal of time came from the church. Bells rang for morning prayers, midday angelus, and evening vespers. The sound rolled through the air like a sacred whisper, reminding peasants to pause and pray, to rest or resume their work. Monasteries and village churches were the keepers of time, ringing bells not only for religious duties but also for events like weddings, deaths, and dangers. Seasons also played a role in timekeeping. Short, bitter winter days forced early rest, while long summer days meant extended labor. Moon cycles, too, were observed for planting and harvesting. Peasants didn't need exact seconds or precise schedules. Their internal clocks were tuned to survival, to feeding the family, and to faith. And the church bell, more than anything, was their trusted timekeeper. Market days and traveling merchants. For the average peasant, most days were bound to the village, working the fields, tending livestock, repairing roofs. But when market day came, the world opened up, if only for a few hours. Market day was more than just buying and selling. It was a spectacle, a gathering, a rare taste of color in a gray and muddy life. Merchants would travel from distant towns, their carts creaking under loads of salt, iron tools, wool, candles, spices, pots, and fabrics in colors peasants had never worn. Peasants brought their own goods, eggs, butter, woven baskets, or carved wood. There was haggling, laughter, shouting, and even pickpockets. Children were wide-eyed at the toys and trinkets. Women examined